That's right, folks. It's week 16. It's the fantasy football semifinals. And today we're going to break down the top slot and out wide matchups that can help you win the semifinals and take you to the championship, folks. All this and more starting right now on the Razzball Fantasy YouTube channel. And to help us, guide us through this journey that we call the slot first wide metric, it's Ben Wasley. Go follow him at Fantasy First Down. Twitter. What's going on, Ben?
What is happening? It's semi-final season. It's nearly Christmas season over here. Of course, I've got my Batman wearing a Santa hat shirt on. We got everything going on. We've had some crazy Thursday night football going on. How did it affect you, Bobby?
Yeah, we were talking pre-show about this. It was kind of every league I didn't get to fully enjoy. Unfortunately, with great success, I had a lot of teams in the semis. Unfortunately, comes with baggage because I was facing Puka in one league, but I had him in another. I was facing against the only guy I didn't have was Cooper Kupp. And so I was okay with him being a landmine last night. But one guy I had a ton of exposure to was Alvin Kamara. And it just that for him to have his worst game of the year, fantasy point wise, it was just like I'm over there just like mumbling to myself, like you gotta be freaking kidding me, because I had this weird feeling like the game, just the Rams, how they've been kind of against these running backs lately. I was like, but you can't sit Kamara. The worst is like you can't sit your studs, but boy, when they flop, you feel like crud. But what about you, man? How'd your games go? How'd your teams do last night?
Yeah. Look, it's the same thing. It's that kind of thing like when you're in over 20 leagues, all of a sudden you get to the semis and you're like, which of these leagues do I really care about most? Like, do I care about the one where I'm playing against friends? Do I care about the one where I'm going to make the most money? Like, what actually matters to me? And it's usually looking at who my opponent is and thinking, oh, how much do I really want to beat this guy?
Oh, I got to tell you, if there's a couple home leagues I'm in where I haven't won ever. Like there's a home league I've been in for like 15 years, and this is the round I lose in probably 85% of the time. I don't know. It's like the money's right there and I go up, losing the second round. Doesn't matter if I'm the 6 seed, the 1 seed, it doesn't matter. So and I have Kamara in that league. So I'm already like, here we fucking go again. One game in, I'm already on tilt. And of course, because of the holidays, you got things going on with family and stuff. Like, I can't even watch all the games like I usually do this week. So there's going to be games where I'll be like, oh, God, I wonder how the Bills are doing right now. And some of the guys we're going to talk about today, let's get into it, Ben, that I have questions about. I'm going to have to ask you a question about some guys like A.K. Josh Palmer to see how we feel about him. Let's get into some of these top wide receiver matchups for week 16. What do you got for us today?
Yeah, look, we got a heap going on. We got some pretty ones. We got some ugly ones. The ugly ones being the Giants versus the Eagles. Ew. But we also got Chiefs against the Raiders, Jets against the Commanders, Bills against the Chargers. We got the Vikings against the Lions and the Seahawks against the Titans. All of their wide receivers have good out-wide matchups. So let's get into them. We'll start with the Giants against the Eagles. And it's been hard to find anyone to start for the Giants. It's totally unclear who the starting top Giants receiver is. Darius Slayton's playing every down, but he only has one top 30 finish all season. Wan'Dale Robinson's their top option, but he's a slot guy, not an out-wide guy, and this is an out-wide matchup. The Eagles are the second best out-wide matchup. They're only the 10th best slot matchup. And then there's Jalen Hyde, who seems to have bigger boom games, but he's only playing 70% of snaps, and he's getting 3 targets each of the last 2 weeks. Who can we trust here? Bobby, are you starting any of these guys?
Probably not. Unfortunately, as much as a Giants fan, I would love to say it's just the problem is there is no consistency. There's no, like, I can't sit here and tell you. I looked at the numbers and like, if you look at the Eagles, yes, they lean out wide. They also lean air yards. They're 7th in air yards allowed this season and only 12th in yards after the catch. But when you're thinking about it, okay, air yards is that's Darius Slayton and Jalen Hyde. It kind of goes along with the fact that they allow a lot of points out wide. But if you're looking at like man versus zone, Slayton's better this season against man. Eagles lean man. That means that Darius Slayton, right? No, but if you look at lineup percentages, the guys who have beaten up on the Eagles, DK Metcalf, Michael Gallup, Gabe Davis type players, they line up on the side of Jalen Hyatt. So I'm like, this isn't going to be a redraft question. I think it's more of like if you're in a dart throw league and you want to play like a deeper guy in like DFS, maybe you go with Darius Slayton or Jalen Hyatt. but in redraft purposes, maybe PPR, Ben, what's your thoughts about Wan'Dale in PPR formats?
I just can't trust him at all in this matchup. I just don't think it works. He's got such a low ceiling. I just can't imagine a situation where if you're in the semifinals, you're probably not struggling for guys like Wan'Dale Robinson. I guess it's possible, but even if you are, he's just not a guy I want to touch. I think probably the only guy I'm actually really interested here is Darren Waller. You can feel like with Darren Waller a little bit healthier, he could come in and get more involved. Now, he is copping more of the slot matchup, but realistically, start everyone against the Eagles has generally been the mantra. And I feel like Darren Waller's the only guy that you'd really consider starting here, given he's basically going to be the number one receiver. Darius Slayton's interesting. I do think there's upside there, but I can't imagine a situation where you'd start him.
Because of that comment you made, are you worried about the Eagles defense in this matchup? To start for
at the DST?
Yeah.
Not really. No, I don't think so. I feel like they mostly get by making big plays, and because they're making a lot of big plays, they're getting you a lot of points. It's just they're also conceding a lot of fantasy points to their opponent. It works really well in both directions.
All right.
Yeah. Let's move on. Let's talk about the Chiefs. Now, the Chiefs has been all over the place, and they're taking on the Raiders. And the Raiders hasn't typically been a good wide receiver matchup. Season long, they're only the 21st best wide receiver matchup. But we only look at the last 6 weeks because that's what's happening now. And realistically, even though they're 30th against the slot, they're the 3rd best out wide matchup. So you want to target out wide receivers against the Raiders. The problem is, who's the Chiefs' best wide receiver? Well, it's their slot guy. It's Rashee Rice. He's the only viable option, and they're really quite tricky against the slot. If you look at the notable matchups recently, the guys booming against them are guys like Tyreek Hill, Garrett Wilson, Josh Palmer, things like that. They're all out wide guys, but Rashee Rice, last time he played against them, 3 or 4 weeks ago, had 8 receptions for 107 yards and a touchdown. No other wide receiver with the Chiefs had over 3 receptions. So while it's not typically a good slot matchup, Rashee Rice made it work last week. Are we starting Rice? Is there another receiver we should be considering here, Bobby?
Yeah, Rashee Rice is the start of the week, probably for me this week. He's a must-start wide receiver too, probably even a wide receiver 1. And just to bring up the point you just brought up, I don't know, it had something maybe to do with Sky Moore's injury, but Rashee Rice has moved out wide. He's actually led the team in out wide routes over the last 2 games. So it's a relatively new thing, but he's now the number 1. He's now running the most routes on the team for wide receivers, and now he's playing a lot more on the outside. About 60% of his snaps have been out wide over the last 2 games. So right there, check. The other thing about the Raiders, they're 29th in air yards, but they're 4th in yards after the catch allowed. That's check, because guess who's number 2 in yards after the catch per reception this season? You guessed it, Rashee Rice. The other thing, too, is they're a heavy zone team, the Raiders, and Rashee Rice is just dominant, according to PFF, against zone. So check. Every check, he checks every box. On top of that, you just brought up 8-107 and won the last time they played. Wheels up. I'm going to probably have a hard time finding 12 guys I'd rather start ahead of Rashee Rice.
Yeah, agreed. He's probably top 12 for me. Last week was the first game he played over 90% snaps. The snap counts for the Chiefs have been all over the place all season. Earlier in the season, it was all Sky Moore and MVS. And now those guys and Richie James have combined for just 40% of snaps last game. It was more Justin Watson playing about 60% of snaps, Kadarius Toney playing 40% of snaps. Mecole Hardman probably returns this week. So it's a total mess outside Rashee Rice. Rice is the guy you have to start. Now, speaking of teams that only have one reliable wide receiver, it's the Jets against the Commanders. So the Commanders have been the 2nd best matchup season long. And in the last 6 games, they've been the fourth best out wide matchup and the best slot matchup. You can attack the Commanders through the air any way that you want. They're averaging 36.3 points per game against them in fantasy. The last few weeks, Cooper Kupp went over 100 yards with a touchdown. Tyreek Hill went 150 yards and 2 touchdowns. CeeDee Lamb had a touchdown. Darius Slayton had a touchdown. DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett both got over 90 yards. So we're talking a team that every opponent has been able to attack over the last few weeks. Now, it's a little bit trickier because we're talking about the Jets and we're only talking about Garrett Wilson. He's really their only viable option. He's got 6 top 20 finishes in their last 9 games. Do we have to start Garrett Wilson, or is this a guy we can get away from, Bobby?
It's tough because he hasn't played a ton. over the last few seasons. Like last year, he had one spot start against, ironically, the Jets, and that Jets defense is legit. So he didn't have a big time game, maybe like 170 yards. Then you look 2 years prior, you're looking at, his time with the New Orleans Saints. He started 4 games. He was over 214 yards in 3 of the 4, which is pretty good. But, the matchup tells you Garrett Wilson should be a wide receiver 3, right? I mean, he's got to, I just don't love the idea of starting Garrett Wilson because of the Trevor Siemian thing but the Commanders have been so bad that, like, if he could do, like, it's just been Tim Boyle and Zach Wilson, and, like, he still figures out a way to give you enough targets to make a solid PPR fantasy day. So I think he's fine. I think this is a perfect guy to bring to the Sunday live show we're doing on Sunday for an hour. By the way, just quick update. We're doing only an hour this Sunday. It's Christmas Eve, folks. Get over it, but we're going to give you an hour because we love you. Garrett Wilson's an interesting name. I think he's going to be a wide receiver 3. If you look at the metrics, ADOT, yards after the catch, I mean, he's 56 in ADOT, and the Commanders will have the second most air yards. So, I mean, okay, great, but that's not really his role. He's not like this big-time air yards guy. He doesn't dominate after the catch this season. He's been big because the offense hasn't been good. The quarterback play hasn't been good. So I think he's fine. I think he's a wide receiver 3, but I don't think he's going to be this huge wide receiver 1 against this really juicy matchup.
I actually feel a little bit better about him. He's a solid wide receiver 2 for me. The reason being his consistency, those 6 top 20 finishes in his last 9 games. He's getting it done regularly with worse quarterbacks. I actually think that Trevor Siemian may be the best quarterback that they've had this season for wide receivers. He does air it out a lot more. We saw those 5 games that he started against the Saints 2 years ago. He averaged 216 yards, and he was averaging 2 touchdowns and half an intercept. He was getting it done. Now, he did struggle with the Bears last year against the Jets, but it was against the Jets. We know that's a tough matchup. He has played a third of a game against the Falcons and 2/3 of a game against the Dolphins this season, and he only totaled 176 yards with no touchdowns and 2 intercepts. So that's a bit concerning, but this is a significantly better matchup. And so because I kind of like Simeon's upside there, I do like the idea of starting Garrett Wilson. Having said that, don't start Alan Lazard. He's not going to be involved. He may be at the start of last week. We have no idea if he's at the start of this week. And don't start Xavier Gibson. He's only playing 60% snaps. Can't trust him. It's only Garrett Wilson, and it's probably only this week, but I would be considering starting him as a wide receiver 2.
I think we're doing the injustice of not, like, kind of diving a little bit into that New Orleans Saints time because, like, if you look at the guys he was playing with, Michael Thomas was out. His number 1 receiver was Traquan Smith. Traquan Smith was his number 1 receiver in targets and receptions and yards, and now he's got Garrett Wilson. And so Traquan Smith, in the 4 games he was starting in that sample, he averaged just under 50 yards a game. So, like I said, I think he gets there at PPR, but Garrett Wilson is 3 times the player Traquan Smith is. So you got to feel pretty good about the matchup. So maybe you're right, Ben. Maybe he is a rock-solid top 24 option.
Yeah, I think definitely Sunday is when you're going to want to ask those start-sit questions for sure.
There you go.
Speaking of Sunday, Bills against the Chargers. We've seen the Chargers are getting blown up, especially given they did it against the Raiders. So you've got to feel like the Bills are going to win this game easily. The question is, how are they going to win it? Well, the Chargers are the 3rd best wide receiver matchup season long. In the last few weeks, they've been 6th against wide and 20th against slot, mainly because teams have just needed to run on them. They haven't really needed to throw that much. They've also had some matchups where there's not the greatest wide receivers. We still saw Devontae Adams go for over 100 yards and get a touchdown last week. We saw Cortland Sutton get his touchdown. We saw Devontae Parker go for 64 yards. Zay Flowers got a touchdown. Romeo Dobbs got a touchdown. So we're not seeing them play against the best wide receiver opponents, and teams are still managing to get it done. So you'd have to feel like the Bills are going to win this game easily. The question is, do they do it through the air? Is there enough volume for Stefon Diggs? Is he a must start this week? He has struggled of late. Bobby, what do you think?
Yeah, Diggs is in no matter what. You got to just roll with the fact that the other problem with this situation is, like, if you watch that game last week, okay? If you watch the Raiders-Chargers game last week, and on the flip side, the polar opposites, the Bills didn't even throw. I think Josh Allen, like 94 yards passing in that game. They ran the ball 100 times. That's insane. Then on the flip side of that, the Raiders beat them 63 to like 22. Okay. it doesn't get much worse from a passing game standpoint for an offense. Like you would think in that moment, you're like, well, Devontae Adams they don't need him. Well, Devontae Adams and Jacoby Myers got theirs. Diggs is in. But the question for me, it comes Gabe Davis. Like when you're looking at Gabe Davis, it's really feast or famine, like boom or bust. And people always say, oh, what does that actually mean? It means Gabe Davis. Like Gabe Davis is either 0 points or 20. And so when you're looking at the games where he's gone off, Philadelphia, Tampa Bay, over the last X amount of weeks, those are out wide matchups. Those are really good out wide matchups. And that's where you beat the Chargers out wide. And I just like, they're 4th in air yards. They're 1st in yards after the catch allowed. Gabe Davis is 8th in ADOT. So he's this high. Now they're going to be out of Buffalo. They're not in the bad weather. They're going to be in a dome in LA. It's like, I want to trust Gabe Davis as like, hey, if you played Puka Nacua on Thursday night and you need a flex that's going to boom too, you might need to go to Gabe Davis. So asking for a friend, Ben, do you recommend Gabe Davis this week if Diggs is an auto start?
I feel like it's a really tricky situation, man. We just don't know what the Bills are going to do. It was ridiculous last week. Stefon Diggs ran 16 routes last week, and he was out there on every passing route. They just weren't throwing the ball. And there's no reason to believe they would need to throw the ball this week. The Chargers are a top 10 run matchup as well. You can really easily run on the Chargers. They've got 3 viable running backs they're using. I feel like if they get up early, they may just choose to run for the rest of the game. For that reason, I just can't trust Gabe Davis. He's got no receptions in 4 of his last 6 games. Now, I admit they were tough matchups. In the last 6 games, they played against the Broncos, Jets, Chiefs, and Cowboys. And against the Cowboys, as we said, they hardly threw the ball as well. Davis himself ran 15 routes in that game. So we can't really blame Davis for that. They are tough matchups, and he does struggle in tough matchups. This is a really easy matchup. It's just a question of how they're going to use him. So for me, Stefon Diggs is someone that you have to start, even though you don't feel good about it. Gabe Davis, I'm not starting. I can't trust him because we don't know what's going to happen. Dawson Knox being back hurts as well. You have to feel like Khalil Shakir is going to be the main one that is hurt by Knox being back, but they may drop Gabe Davis's snaps a little bit as well, simply to get Knox out there more and get the blocking going so they can keep that run game going and make sure that they're staying healthy going into the postseason.
Maybe the best bet is just put $1 in DFS, throw Gabe Davis in there, and then feel good about having Gabe Davis, some value there. If he goes off, you're like, all right, cool, I can win some money, but don't risk it in your redraft fantasy football.
Exactly. I can't imagine if you made it to the semifinals, the odds of you feeling good about starting Gabe Davis and needing him is pretty low. But if you find yourself a long way behind, he is someone that has the potential to get you 20, 25 PPR points if everything goes right for him. So if you need him for that reason, that's viable as well. Now, where things are getting really interesting is for the Vikings against the Lions. The Lions season long are the 8th best wide receiver matchup. They're averaging 30 PPR points against them each game. And they are 16th against out wide recently and 6th against the slots. They're a better slot matchup, but they have played against some solid slot receivers recently as well. Notable performances recently, Cortland Sutton went 5 for 71. DJ Moore's played him twice. In both games, he scored a touchdown. He combined for 13 receptions and 165 yards. So he went off against them. Chris Olave went over 100 yards. Christian Watson went 5 for 94 with a touchdown. So they have allowed big plays. The question is, given there's no clear slot receiver for the Vikings, they all travel there, who benefits from this matchup? Is this a good matchup for Jefferson and Addison? Can we start Addison at all? Obviously, you have to start Justin Jefferson, but what are you doing with Addison this week?
Yeah, Jerry Jacobs is out too, one of the top outside cornerbacks for the Lions, so that's going to help this matchup. The other thing too is it's a dome game, so like the road golf home. And listen, we just did a breakdown on Razzball.com. We actually reviewed home versus away splits for quarterbacks for fantasy points. By Derek wrote that, Lineup Builder. Go check it out. It's a very interesting article because it highlights, how good guys are on the road versus home. Now, Goff, of course, and that Chicago game was a disaster, but he's been okay otherwise on the road this season. And he's in a dome, so it shouldn't be a major issue. In a game where they got to win, the Vikings got to win, and Nick Mullins has provided some oomph to that passing attack, more consistency as more of a Kirk Cousins-light type player, so that's good for them. Addison looked good with him, too. So I think this is a good example of, the matchup's good. The offense on the other side is good. They're missing a key piece. And I do think you could start Jordan Addison. I think Justin Jefferson, of course, is the play, even though so far Addison has looked better with Nick Mullins after one game. Of course, tongue-in-cheek, it's been one game. So if you look at how you beat the Lions, it's air yards. They're 5th in air yards allowed this season, but 25th in yards after the catch. Neither guy is relatively great in ADOT. Jefferson's 44th, Addison's 52nd among about 103 qualified receivers. So they're both about average. But at the same time, if you're a wide receiver, if a team allows air yards, they both get enough ADOT to take advantage of this matchup. So I'm okay with both guys. I think Addison's more of a you got to bring him to the Sunday show type player. You got to see okay, who are you starting Addison over? But I think Addison is an option this week as well. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Addison's going to entirely depend on who else you have available. He is that mid-range wide receiver 3 guy. You could be starting him, but it depends on the situation. I think the biggest thing here is Nick Mullins. Nick Mullins has 18 career starts. He's played for the 49ers and the Browns as well as the Vikings. And across that time, he's averaged 270 yards a game on average. So he really airs it out a lot. So we should expect a lot of yards, and that's fantastic for Jefferson and Addison. Now, he does throw a lot of intercepts, which is why he hasn't had more starts than 18 over the last 5 or so years. But he also can find the end zone as well. So there's plenty of upside here for Jefferson at Addison. Jefferson is an absolute must-start. There's no situation where you're sitting Jefferson. Addison, the concern for me, 5 straight single-digit half PPR games in a row until last week where he blew up against the Bengals. That means that was the Mullins thing a one-off, or was that more of a matchup thing? We just don't know the answer to that. And when you're in the semifinals, that's hard to trust. So I certainly wouldn't be pushing to get Addison into my lineup, but he's someone that you may need to start. So definitely bring that one on Sunday. Now, speaking of interesting matchups to talk about on Sundays, the Seahawks against the Titans. We saw DK Metcalf has been good recently, but Tyler Lockett's been a little bit all over the place. The Titans season long are the 7th best wide receiver matchup. They're 7th out wide recently, 16th against the slot. But we know we're talking about the main out wide guys in Metcalf and Lockett. It's a little bit tough to trust Jackson Smith-Njigba, even though he was my streamer of the week last week, and he did pay off because of that late touchdown. Notable performances against the Titans. Noah Brown blew up last week, 82 yards and a touchdown. Tyreek missed half the game, but Waddle went off. Pittman went for over 100 yards and a touchdown. Even Jonathan Mingo managed 60 yards. Ridley went for 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. Lately, the top wide receivers have been blowing up against the Titans. But the question is, can we trust Tyler Lockett? I think Metcalf for most people is a start, but is Tyler Lockett someone you would trust in your fantasy semifinal?
Well, if you look at the numbers, first of all, number one, the Titans defense is absolutely decimated. I mean, decimated by injuries. If you look at I'm trying to pull up their 6 score this week because when I'm going through this stuff, I kind of look at the injuries too, and they're both safeties are down. Sean Murphy-Bunting is down. They just saw Christian Fulton is now on IR. 4 of their top 6 secondary players this season are not going to be in this game. So, okay, that right there should tell you one thing. Their offensive line and secondaries are they need the most communication, right? So you need continuity for those sides. Those 2 position groups need continuity more than anybody because they have to work with each other on the back end, especially in zone. You have to figure out, okay, you guys are taking this deep. You guys are going to cover this area this time and blah, blah, blah. And on top of that, the Titans are 6th in air yards allowed this season. And that's DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. They are air yards guy. Metcalf, 13th in ADOT, 20th in yards after the catch, which is good both ways. But Tyler Lockett, 46th in ADOT, 84th in yards after the catch per reception. So, yes, I think, yes, you could start based on all the injuries, based on how you beat the Titans anyway. I actually think the Seahawks I know there could be a letdown because they just beat the Eagles, but I think the pushback on that, it was without Geno Smith. Geno Smith now has to show the team, I'm still the best quarterback. So I do like the fact that Geno was out. Drew Lock beat the Eagles. Now Geno comes back in. He can't have a letdown game. So I think that, call it a hunch. I'm right. Jason Myers, by the way, K1 kicker of the week. If you get Jason Myers, put him in your lineups. I absolutely love him as well.
Yeah, I actually like Jason Myers as well. I think he was my kicker streamer this week. But yeah, look, I'm inclined to agree. It's really tricky with the Titans at the moment. They do have Roger McCreary back. He was out for a little while. He's a very good nickel corner, but they're missing basically everyone else. Their free safety at the moment is Kayvon Wallace, who they only just got off waivers from Arizona. So they really are struggling to get healthy. And I'm not even sure if he's playing this week. So they really are struggling to get healthy. They're going to be having basically rookie undrafted corners starting for them out wide, which means that they're going to be attacked through the air often during this game. The question is, who's it go through? Well, DK Metcalf only has one game with over 6 receptions all season. He's getting by on touchdowns and big plays, but you'd have to feel like there's going to be big plays in this game. Tyler Lockett, you'd feel like you'd be disappointed, but he is averaging over 7 targets a game. He's just had no big games, no 100-yard games, and he's only got 4 touchdowns. He's had at least 8 touchdowns each of the last 5 years. And if you take that touchdown production and put it onto his current receiving production, he ends up being a top 20 wide receiver. He hasn't actually been too bad. He's just not getting touchdowns, and that's the real issue. He's also getting less yards per game. Yards per reception. In every previous season except one, he's averaged 12.3 or more yards per reception. This season, he's averaging 10.8. So while touchdown regression is possible, he clearly has taken a step back this season. I'm still starting him. He's a high-end wide receiver 3 for me. I'd start him over guys like Jordan Addison. I feel like this is a good game for him. And I even think you can start Jackson Smith-Njigba. He does have less upside, but he is someone that in this matchup could get involved because there could be a lot of yards through the air.
Like it.
Now, where this gets interesting is the slot matchups. And we are talking Adam Thielen, who was a fantasy darling early in the season. He faces the Packers, who have been a tricky wide receiver matchup earlier in the season. They are the 19th toughest wide receiver matchup. However, they're very good against the slot. While they're 23rd versus out wide recently, they're 4th best matchup against the slot in the last 6 weeks. Now, it does help that they've played a lot of good slot receivers in that time. Chris Godwin, who spent some time in the slot, went 10 for 155 last week. Wan'Dale Robinson went 6 for 79. Rashee Rice had a good game against them. Amon-Ra St. Brown did what he does against them. Keenan Allen went for over 100 yards and a touchdown. So they have copped some good slot receivers, and it's hard to tell if this is a good slot matchup or if they've just played against very good slot receivers recently. Adam Thielen's been struggling. He's had 13 total receptions in the last 4 weeks. He's had no weeks below 5 receptions before that since week 1. So something's clearly changed. Can we trust Adam Thielen in such an important matchup?
I think what's changed a little bit is that they've first off, Frank Wright is gone, and they've changed the coaching staff. The other thing I think that's changed a little bit is Jonathan Mingo. They've tried to make him a little more involved. I think they're like, all right, thanks, Adam. We appreciate you doing your thing, but now we need to figure out what we have at this young number 2 receiver that we have. So I think Mingo has taken on more of a prominent role. And the other problem with Adam Thielen, it was all volume based. Like he does it. If you look at his numbers, he's 86th in ADOT out of 103 qualified receivers and 69th in yards after the catch. So he's not doing either relatively well. It was more like, hey, you're going to get 5, 6, 7 catches every single week and get you around 50-something yards. In PPR formats, he's getting you double digits, high floor. However, when the targets start going down because they're starting to share a little more with Jonathan Mingo, that's where I think the problem starts with him. Now, the flip side of this whole thing is like the matchups for slot-wise for Thielen haven't been necessarily good over the last few weeks either. So I think that's where it flips a little bit for me. Historically, he's actually been pretty good against the Packers. He beat up on Jair Alexander a few years ago, too, as the primary guy with the Vikings. So I actually think he's going to be okay this week. And I think if you're in a PPR, this is a PPR-only thing. I think if you're in half or standard, it's not even worth the upside. But if you're in full PPR, I think he offers you a safe enough floor that if he ends up finding the end zone, great. But I think he'll be good in PPR formats.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that's changed for me is that they're running the ball so much now. Earlier in the season, Adam Thielen was running 40, 45 routes a game. Last week, he ran 20-something routes during the game, and that's just not enough to get him the volume that he needs. They've got Chuba Hubbard running the ball over 20 times a game, and they're getting Miles Sanders involved, and they're playing against the Packers, who are a top 10 running back matchup. I feel like we might find that they just run the ball a heap this game, and because of that, the volume won't be there for Thielen. That's enough for me to say I don't really want to start Thielen this week if I've got the choice. Now, in PPR, you might not have the choice. He's still a low-end wide receiver 3 for me. I just feel like there's better options available given the matchup, given what they've been doing recently, given the fact that they probably will be able to run the ball this week.
Before we jump into the downgrades, let's get to some questions here.
Let's do it.
Yeah, so we have first from Bryce about Amari Cooper against the Texans this week on the road. What's your thoughts here? Do you trust Amari Cooper in your lineups?
No, but I'd still start him. Amari Cooper's one of those guys that you can't trust, and it's nothing to do with Amari Cooper himself. It's just the way this offense works. There are going to be games where they just run the ball a lot, or where they just throw everything to David Njoku. With Joe Flacco as quarterback, though, you can feel a lot better about Cooper. We saw he had a massive game last week. He did it on very few receptions. He went over 100 yards on 4 receptions. And anytime that sort of thing's happening, you're always going to get a lot of variance in your numbers. But it also gives a whole lot of upside. So Cooper's not a safe play, but he's a good play for me. Would you start Cooper, Bobby?
He's one of those guys where last week his matchup was not good. And honestly, for almost the entire game, I was watching. He had like 6 half PPR points or something. I'm like, oh, that was a good call. And nope, on the sideline, catches it. You're just like, the only thing I will say is that the Browns are traveling. They've been a little bit, their defense has actually been pretty bad on the road this season for whatever reason. But they are playing Case Keenum. Like, I would be a little more excited to start Amari Cooper if the Texans had CJ Stroud and company, because it'd be more scoring volume. This could be a little bit higher, like a lower scoring game, but I'm not fading Amari Cooper. I think the better question, Bryce, is who do you have to replace him this week? So, yeah, I think if you want, Bryce, if you don't have the guys right now, come to our Sunday live show at 9 a.m. PST, 12 o'clock Eastern. We're going to be on for about an hour this week. Come bring your start-sit question, because maybe there'll be better options than Cooper. Like Tyler Lockett, I would feel a little more confident starting this week over Amari Cooper. What's your thoughts, Ben?
I think if it's PPR, I might start someone like Lockett, for example. I think Cooper's a really good play in half PPR. As Too Much Sauce says, his touchdown last week was really fluky, and I think we need to keep that in mind. He does have just really high variance, and it depends on your situation. You might also be in a situation where you have a big lead, and if you have a big lead, you don't really need a high variance player. You need a really safe player. So it depends on your situation. It depends on what happened in Thursday Night Football and how that's going to affect what you're going to do going forward. So it really is scenario based with someone like Cooper.
Yeah. What's your thoughts about this one? Cooper or Ridley?
I'd go Cooper. I mean, they're both the same type of player. They're both that high variance player, but I've ranked them like pretty much back to back. In half PPR, I'd go Cooper. I think Ridley's a little bit more interesting in PPR because he does have those games where he gets a lot of receptions, but gosh, he's hard to trust. It's just he has so many down weeks, and the matchup against Tampa Bay, it's a pretty good out wide matchup, but it's not the kind of one where you'd really want to trust him. So I'd probably lean Cooper for the upside. But if you want someone safe, this is that sort of scenario. If you're looking for safety, Ridley's probably the slightly safer option. But I don't know. For me, they're very close to each other. What about you?
Yeah, no Zay Jones, no Christian Kirk. And he's playing the team that allows the 3rd most air yards this season. Like, really? Like Calvin Ridley, I'm going Calvin Ridley just on principle. If you can't get it done in a top 3 air yards matchup, that's what you do out wide against a team. Charlton Davis in and out of the lineup. Jamel Dean has been in and out of the lineup. Their safeties have been banged up. Like, if you can't get it done in this matchup with no Zay Jones and no Christian Kirk, what are you even doing here, folks? So I'm going on principle Calvin Ridley.
And it is PPR. And I think in PPR, yeah, you have to go Ridley in PPR in that matchup.
All right, I think we got one more. Yeah.
What are we thinking about Josh Palmer?
Let's get into the downgrades. This is perfect trade. Jamie, it's like you're part of the show, buddy. We got to get you on at least once this year before we close out. But this is perfect because, Ben, we got some downgrades to talk about, and this man might be popping up. So let's get into it.
Yeah, we got the Colts against the Falcons. Falcons have been tough all season. We saw what they did to Mike Evans and Marquise Brown. They got 1 reception each. Everyone except Chris Olave, for some reason, has struggled against the Falcons. They just have a really good defense at the moment. The Cardinals against the Bears. The Bears have actually been one of the better matchup for wide receivers season long, but out wide, they've been brutal recently. They're the best slot matchup and the worst out wide matchup. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But with Marquise Brown out, that's pretty much irrelevant for fantasy. The Commanders against the Jets. We know that the Commanders are a great defensive matchup. Now they face the Jets. Can you start Terry McLaurin after he blew up last week? And the Chargers against the Bills, which talked about Joshua Palmer. Is Palmer someone that you can start? Bobby, what jumps out for you there?
Yeah, you know what? The Palmer thing, I'm interested in your thoughts. I've been kind of wishy-washy on him because we'll get to that in a second. But Michael Pittman, first off, the one thing that worries me about Pittman is that, like, the Falcons, the one thing they do better than any defense is yards after the catch, right? So they're 29th in yards after the catch allowed this season. That's a problem because Pittman's ADOT is 84th among 103 qualified receivers and 30th in yards after the catch per reception. So that's where he does his damage. So I think when you're looking at the type of matchup that he has this week, he's probably a PPR guy. Like, I could see him getting the thing with Pittman, he might get 8 receptions for 64 yards. So I think in half PPR and standard leagues, I might be okay with pivoting from Pittman in this matchup. But in full PPR, I think you got to start him. He just gets too much volume. He catches too many passes. And I think he'll get there in full PPR formats. McLaurin's the one guy I'm actually 100% out. Marquise Brown, maybe I would have been, but he's not playing. So Terry McLaurin against the Jets. If you're looking at the Jets matchup, they're 32nd in air yards this season. So they're the most dominant air yards defense. Terry McLaurin is 33rd in ADOT, 66 in yards after the catch. Not only are they tough on the perimeter, but they don't allow air yards in general anyway. And that's where Terry McLaurin does his damage. So I'm fading Terry McLaurin out of this group. Now, Josh Palmer, I'm just kind of tilting. I'm wishy-washy. And I might need your help on this because I'm looking at the numbers and I'm like, he's really good. Like, metric-wise, Josh Palmer this season. A lot of that's due to Justin Herbert. 22nd in ADOT, 15th in yards after the catch per reception. It's pretty good in both areas. Now, I know the Bills are red hot. They just embarrassed the Cowboys. But they do allow one guy. It was Rashee Rice. And I know CeeDee Lamb had a rushing touchdown, but he did have 7 receptions in his game. I know last week Easton Stick was not great. That game was a disaster. But now you have 10 days. Now they're back home 10 days after that game. I expect Stick to play. He didn't look bad against Denver. And he also, by the way, threw for 3 touchdowns against the Raiders. I know it was garbage time, but it's still relevant. I'm really curious to hear what you guys say about Josh Palmer. Talk to me, Ben. What's your thoughts about Josh Palmer?
I don't trust him. It's pretty simple. He's that Gabe Davis style boom bust kind of player. He's going to have big plays, and realistically, the chances of him having big plays against the Bills is pretty low. It's possible, but I don't think you want to be starting someone who needs a big play to come off unless you need to really chase a game. If you need big points from a guy, Joshua Palmer could put up a massive score, but realistically, he's struggled for most of this season when he's been healthy. He's just not consistent enough. The funny thing is Quinton Johnston actually has double-digit PPR points the last 3 weeks. He's been the better player outcome-wise, but realistically, Palmer just hasn't been there. He hasn't been healthy. Now that he's getting healthy, at least he's a chance. I can't start Palmer. I don't trust Palmer at all. He's someone that I'm avoiding. I don't like this matchup. I don't like the situation. I don't actually trust Easton Stick to play against a team that cares.
So unfortunately, my one league, I had to set it, forget it. I had to touch my lineup all year, and now Keenan Allen's out, right? So I had Josh Palmer in there as a handcuff, kind of. But the other guy I have is Gabe Davis. So I have Gabe Davis or Josh Palmer as my 2 options now because my other guy is Nico Collins. Because, like, do I trust Nico with Case Keenum with a bum calf, straight against the Browns? So in that scenario, Nico Collins / Noah Brown, I could have either one, Palmer or Gabe Davis. What do you think about those that scenario?
Wow. I would have to go Nico Collins. At least you feel like there's a little bit of a flaw there. Now, to be fair, Nico Collins in that exact Bills matchup had like 1 reception for 13 yards. Actually, it was against the Jets. Had 1 reception for 13 yards. So he does have a low floor, but he has at least a more accessible ceiling than someone like Palmer or Davis, where you really are hoping for boom bust. Now, having said that, even that league, you're like 20 points behind already. It's a different situation. You go for the Davis or Palmer, you go for that upside. Though Nico Collins has a lot of upside usually as well. I don't feel like he has that same upside with Case Keenum.
I know. Damn.
Yeah.
It's like one of those things where I'm like, it's like I was set up all year that the Keenan Allen not being available now. And then I also had Ramondre Stevenson. So that was my other backup option. He's out. And I'm like, now it's like you're getting into the depths of things. Like, in reality, I was actually thinking of starting Isaiah Likely because of the fact that he's been almost the de facto 1 over the last few weeks, and he's probably the safest one out of everybody. But then I'm starting double tight ends. I don't know if I want to do that. So it's
It's funny. It's that, like, when we talk about these matchups, we talked about the Cardinals against the Bears, and we said you can't start anyone in the Cardinals against the Bears. It's a terrible out wide matchup, but it's a great slot matchup. You know who that's great for? Trey McBride. Like, Trey McBride is someone I would start ahead of pretty much every wide receiver. It's a fantastic matchup for him. Realistically, there are a lot of people out there who are probably going to want to start, say, Trey McBride and Evan Ingram, or Trey McBride and David Njoku, because they both have great matchups. They're both in great situations. They're essentially the number one option on their teams with everyone else injured. I feel like you're probably going to be wanting to lean putting a tight end in your flex if you're considering starting someone like a Gabe Davis or even a Terry McLaurin. I know Terry McLaurin had his best ever game last week, but the week before he had no receptions. You just can't trust him. And even though Jalen Waddle seems to go off every time he plays against the Jets, Terry McLaurin isn't Jalen Waddle. He's a totally different sort of player. So I would rather sit Terry McLaurin and start someone like a top tight end, because there's a good chance you got two of them. These guys were drafted late. It's very easy to have picked up two of these tight ends.
And this I would trust me. Trey McBride, if he was an option, that'd be great. But likely seem my tight end too in these leagues. So it's like the 49ers have sprung a leak. You just brought up Trey McBride. He played well. TJ Hawkinson a few months, like about 6 weeks ago, had a big game. When they face a good tight end, for some reason, they allow those points. The other thing too is, like, I personally think the 49ers are going to do their thing at home against the Ravens. So that probably could mean some checkdowns to Isaiah Likely. So yeah, I'm not enjoying this. If Nico was 100% healthy, I probably would just go all in on Nico. But the fact that he's dealing with Case Keenum and an injury, it's like, but yes, at least if you start Nico and he flops, you could be like, well, I went with my studs.
It was Nico Collins.
It's Nico Collins. Yeah. So I hear you on that. Any other thoughts before we get to your streamers and stashes?
I have one thought for you, a question for you, actually. I just traded for Michael Pittman in a dynasty league. I traded away Tyreek Hill, and I traded for Michael Pittman and a 2024 first. Now, obviously, everyone in the league went, you just traded away Tyreek Hill. That's crazy. But to me, like, I'm out of the playoffs now. The guy I traded him to is still in the playoffs. We trade all the way to the end of the season in this league for some reason. To me, I was like, well, that's a pretty solid win. I'm getting the younger player. I'm getting a guy who's going to be good for a long time. It's a PPR league, and I'm getting a first. And everyone's like, you just gave up the best player in fantasy. What are you doing? What do you think?
Yeah, so it really comes down to the Gardner Minshew versus Anthony Richardson stuff. Like, we only saw 2 games this season where Anthony Richardson essentially played the full game. So I'm just looking up the stats now because I'm curious, because Richardson looked better than I thought he would as a passer, which is great. And Pittman was okay. 9 catches in those 2 games, 112 yards, a touchdown. So that's a good building block. But the other thing,
also a free agent.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, you're right. You could probably move on too. But I just can't imagine the Colts allow him to walk. They need that. They need an alpha number 1. Josh Downs is a nice player, and Alex Pierce is good too, but they all fit into their roles perfectly. Alex Pierce is your perimeter outside guy. You have a really good yards after catch slot guy, and then you have a guy who could be a target hog as your wide receiver 1. So, and the other, so I actually don't mind it. I think because the other thing with Tyreek Hill, he basically made it seem like this might be his last year, maybe even next year at the latest. So you might get 2 more years out of Tyreek. He's not the type of guy, from what I've heard, that wants to play until he's 35, 36. So yeah, I think long term. Are you out of the playoffs, I'm assuming?
Oh, yeah. I got knocked out. I got in feeling really good, and then I just got blasted last week.
Yeah. So why not? I mean, but you also got the first round pick too associated with that, right? So you got Pittman and a first in next year's draft, not like you got 2026 first rounder too. So it's okay. I think if you're out of it this year, you might as well roll the dice. What if Tyreek Hill gets 2,000 yards and he retires?
Yeah, exactly. I feel like especially in dynasty, you want to be selling off right before a player falls off. And I feel like this is around the time you want to be selling guys like Tyreek Hill, like Devontae Adams, Cooper Kupp. It's probably even a little bit too late for him. Guys like that. I think this is where we need to start thinking about selling those guys. And also your top running backs. Running backs will fall off that in value just all of a sudden without you expecting it. So you want to sell your running backs and your wide receivers while they're still on the edge of looking good.
We don't talk a lot of dynasty because it's the middle of the season, but like, I honestly think every dynasty owner should treat it like redraft, in the sense of like, you should be on top of your lineups. If you're out of the playoffs, you should be hunting the people in the playoffs. Be like, hey, man, it looks like you kind of could use a second flex. Let's talk. Like, you should be proactive in your roster management mid-season because people are more likely to give you premium picks and players when they know, like, for example, if they have an injured star, I don't know, like, a good name here, but off the top of my head, I can't think of anybody. But you have an injured player who's no longer playing right now, and they're just sitting in their IR. You can be like, hey, can I take your IR player? I'll give you, here's a good player right now you can win with. You win that trade the next 2 to 3 years at least, but that guy gets a better player right now. So I think you should always be hunting in Dynasty, especially. Like, be proactive in Dynasty, especially if you get like Ben here. This late in the year, guys want to win right now. They saw Tyreek Hill. He's like, I'll give you Jesus Christ for Tyreek Hill. Let's go. So, I mean, you didn't get Jesus Christ worth, but you got pretty close, Ben. It was pretty good. I like it. So that's a good way to think about Dynasty. Like, always be proactive and make sure you're trying to, not take advantage, but if people are in it right now and you can trade with them, go for it. Give them some assets.
Definitely. Take advantage of other people's opportunities.
There you go. All right, let's get into some streamers and stashes, Ben. Let's
talk streamers. Look, last week was actually my best streamer week. I think 10 out of my 16 streamers last week boomed. It was a great week for streamers, so we're hoping to do it again this week. Favorite QB streamer of the week, Baker Mayfield. He's the top 10 quarterback for me this week. Really love Baker Mayfield. There's a lot of bad quarterback matchups, and there's a lot of people struggling with quarterbacks, so I'd go Baker Mayfield all day. Running back-wise, Devin Singletary is a great matchup. You haven't been starting him most weeks, but I like him. Gus Edwards is someone who's a little bit interesting, but there's not really good running back opportunities. Wide receiver-wise, I'm going T. Higgins and Noah Brown. But my favorite of all the things is Matt Gay, the kicker. Matt Gay is my number one kicker this week. No one else seems to like it, but I feel really good about Matt Gay this week.
Jason Myers is my guy this week, but I think I have Matt Gay in my top 6. So I'm in. I like it.
Yeah. Jason Myers is my other guy. I do have Jason Myers there as well. I've got 2 kicker streamers, Jason Myers and Matt Gay. Love both of them this week. A lot of people are still trying to start guys like Tyler Bass and people like that, Jake Elliott. These guys haven't had a top 12 week in the last 10 weeks. Why are you still starting them? You should be streaming kickers. Don't go based on name recognition with kickers. Go based on who has the best matchup.
Honestly, the biggest hole right now in fantasy is the kicker position. If your league starts kickers, by the way, I personally like kickers. I like starting playing with kickers. Position diversity is always good. More options is better. But my biggest gripe is if your league starts kickers, then you need to care about kickers. Like, you could get 15 to 20 points from the kicker if you're watching this stuff. We've been doing this all year long. Jason Myers has some big games earlier this year for us, and it helped me win weeks. So, yes, Matt Gay, Jason Myers, join us on Sunday. We'll have a full list there too. That's what you really came here, folks. You came for the slot versus wide points per game allowed. You stay for the kickers. That's all we got today, folks. Thanks for joining us once again on the Razzball Fantasy Football Podcast. I want to thank my co-host, Ben Wasley. Go follow him at Fantasy First Down No on Twitter. Go follow him everywhere. This guy's on TikTok. I'm sure he's everywhere, folks. Go follow him.
Everywhere.
Go check him out as well on razzball.com. And go check out all our great articles as well. We will be back on Sunday for 1 hour this week at 9 a.m. PST, 12 o'clock Eastern to answer all your start-sit questions. So make sure you join us once again. Thank you for joining. I'm Bobby LaMarco. We're out of here, folks.
Merry Christmas.